Hello and welcome to New Energy Opportunities 2.0, presented by Energy Voice in association with Bracewell. In addition to our principal partner, we're joined by accomplished guests from Alcazar Energy, AFRY Management Consulting, and Marubeni. I am Ed Reed. I'm an editor here at Energy Voice. And if you're watching, please feel free to participate through the chat functions, and you can submit questions for the panel as we go along. We're here today to talk over some of the emerging opportunities in the Middle East and North Africa. In particular, we're looking at solar, at hydrogen, and at battery storage. At this point, solar's place in the region seems in little doubt. The technology is proved, it's widespread, and there's an incredible demonstration of how something can scale up, as we've seen in the last 10 years. That said, there are some challenges. Amid the global logistics crunch, we've seen prices for solar modules rise, really throwing up some questions about how cheap these opportunities are. There are, potential remedies. People talk about onshoring of manufacturing, but I think it's a valuable reminder of the reliance on global trade and perhaps the vulnerability of those flows, which I think we're all looking again at now. Battery storage seems like a natural complement to solar. Charge it up during the day, use that energy overnight. It's not quite that simple, though. Batteries face challenges in high operating temperatures, but there's a lot of research going on into this, including in Abu Dhabi, about how to tackle it. Hydrogen is another potential sort of storage medium for power and also, of course, for exports. Europe, North America, and the Far East are looking at ways in which to incorporate hydrogen into their energy mix. Most recently, with the war in Ukraine, the European Union has launched its transition plans with an idea of scaling up hydrogen imports, and that's going to play a key role in that energy transition. The MENA region, with its renewable energy resources and the proximity, could be well pleased to meet some of this new demand. But amid this hype, it can be sometimes easy to overlook the challenges. There are high costs, but it seems certain that hydrogen must play a role in future demand. These three technologies all have a part to play. I think there's an interesting counterpoint there about domestic hydrocarbons. In those countries fortunate enough to have them, what's the driver to move beyond cheap, local, proved natural gas? I suppose one of the answers that might be raised to that kind of a question is the idea of policy changes. I mean, I think it would be remiss not to mention that COP is coming to Egypt this year and the UAE next year. So I think there's a commercial side of things, but there's also a policy driver. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how those two factors interplay. But listen, that's enough from me. I'd love to bring in our guests. So first up, I'd like to introduce Clint Stein, who's a partner at Bracewell.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Firstly, on behalf of the Bracewell team, thanks to Ed and Energy Voice for hosting us. Thanks to our learned external panelists, Daniel, David, and Brendan for joining us. And then obviously thanks to all of you for listening today to the presentation. As Ed said, I'm a partner in the Dubai Bracewell office. I've been practicing law for about 30 years. The last 22 years I've been focused on power, and the last 13 years I've been in Dubai. I've been a partner at Bracewell for 6 years, although two of those years between three bookends were with Alcazar Energy as general counsel. So looking back, I was thinking today about the market and the topics we're going to discuss, and looking back over the last 10 years. The region really has had phenomenal growth in renewable energy. So, I was thinking back 10 years ago, there were probably two projects, renewable projects on the horizon. There was the Shams project in Abu Dhabi, and there was the Tafila project in Jordan, the first wind project in Jordan. And if you fast forward 10 years and the number of projects that have been implemented across the region in almost every country in the region, it truly has been a remarkable development. If you look back 10 years ago, speaking to a lot of my colleagues at International Power and in the market, there were a lot of people questioning renewables. A lot of people were saying it's way too expensive. We'll never work without subsidies. This is just never going to catch on. And strange enough, those are some of the questions that are being asked on some of the technologies we're looking at today. So I'm really interested to hear what our panelists are going to be saying about the future of solar, battery storage, and hydrogen. Um, it's going to be very interesting as we roll forward 10 years into the future where we're going to sit. But I'm really very, very keen to hear, and I'm sure everyone else is, to hear all the thoughts of our panelists. So thank you very, very much for joining again. And I hope this is very interesting for everyone. Thanks, Ed. I'll hand back to Ed.
And next up, Oliver Irwin, partner at Bracewell.
Thanks very much, Ed, and thanks to Energy Voice for hosting us today and everyone for tuning in, and also to our external participants. So my name's Oliver Irwin. I'm a partner in Bracewell's project finance team. A large part of my practice is on energy projects in the Middle East region. And so we spend a lot of time talking with our clients and also internally on the three topics we're going to discuss today, which is solar, battery storage, and hydrogen, and how they may impact the market. They're already impacting the market, but how they may impact the market going forward. As a project finance lawyer, I think the thing that most sort of concerns me about, for example, in particular battery storage, is where is the bankable, long-term, predictable revenue stream? We've been fortunate enough to work on some battery storage financings in more mature markets such as the UK, and I'm really interested to hear the panelists' views on how we might develop a bankable market for battery storage projects in the Middle East, because I think undoubtedly with the huge influx of renewable projects, we are going to require some sort of storage mechanism. And it will be interesting to see whether or not we can replicate the tremendously successful, IPP model which we've had in the region over the last couple of decades, which has really facilitated this huge investment on a utility scale in renewables, which has been tremendously impressive. But can we do that for battery storage as well?
Fantastic. And next up, Roy Lazarovitch, partner at Bracewell.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you everyone for joining the call today. I'm a partner at Bracewell's London office, and like Ollie, I'm part of the project finance team specializing in project development and finance, including a lot of projects in the energy space in the Middle East, both traditional energy and energy transition. And from my perspective, one thing that is going to be very interesting today is talking about how this energy transition is going to work. I think in relation to hydrogen specifically, there are a lot of comparisons being made between hydrogen and the LNG market at its early phases. But I think there are quite a few differences between the two. And I think we're going to have a very good debate and discussion today around what the practical reality of that energy transition might be and how we can achieve it.
Fantastic. And Andrej Kormuth, also a partner at Bracewell.
Thanks, Ed, and hello to everyone. My name is Andrej Kormuth, partner at Bracewell here in Dubai. I work together with Clint, and we look after the Middle East practice. I have been in the Middle East for just about 11 years now. 3 of that was in Doha and Qatar, and majority or the remaining time was here in Dubai. Have worked pretty much everywhere in the Gulf, including prior to the snapback of the secondary sanctions, Iran and Tehran too, where we tried to do some deals in terms of renewables and conventional power deals. And prior to my stint in Middle East, I had worked in South Africa, in Johannesburg. I am generally projects agnostic. I've done every conceivable asset that there is, but I've also seen a number of waves in the power sector, from conventional, starting off back in 2010, 2011, all the way to today, where we've got renewables, and renewables very much being the flavor of the month, flavor of, I think, many years to come. And have definitely seen a fantastic evolution in the market here in the Middle East, and I think internationally too. To go to Clint's words, have also been there in terms of the discussions of the early commentaries around the sustainability and longevity of renewables regionally and internationally, particularly because of the price point, and have obviously witnessed, as everyone else had, the massive plunge in the cost of renewables and its competitiveness and genuine, I think, replacer of conventional power deals in the market. So looking forward to participating in this discussion, this panel, and listening, and obviously working with everyone else on the panel in terms of the various different views and topics.
Fantastic. And Daniel Calderon, co-founder and CEO at Alcazar Energy.
Thank you, Ed. And thank you for having me, everybody. So my name is Daniel. I moved to the region about 13 years ago. Before coming to the region, I worked over 10 years with GE Capital. And I came to the region to be the head of investments at Masdar. So I was working in all those projects Clint mentioned at the beginning, the first PV plant of the region, the first CSP plant of the region, the first wind farm of the region. And after spending 5 years with Masdar, we started Alcazar Energy Partners, which was the first independent private investor in renewable energy in the Middle East. We have mobilized over $1 billion over the last 8 years and created about 4,200 jobs. We focus on the oil importing countries of the Middle East, which are the ones with the lower credit rating. As far as the growth of the region is concerned, people are very excited because we had this difficult target by 2020 to deliver $40 billion of investment, and we actually substantially matched that target. So the region has been a successful investment destination for foreign direct investment. But more importantly, that target now is about 140 billion by 2030. So the region is increasingly exciting for foreign direct investments, and I think this session hopefully brings attention to that. With regards to storage, we have not seen storage come into the region yet in large form, largely because these countries are at the early vintages of solar or wind, and countries tend to need storage once the penetration of solar or wind is in the 20s or 30% of the national generation. That's when you really need storage. We're happy to talk more about the opportunities that are coming up. And with regards to hydrogen, I think something that plays very well in the region is grid parity. One of the reasons why renewable energy is so attractive in the Middle East and North Africa is because most of all the projects that we have seen for our investors, the cost of electricity has been below the grid parity in the country. That is, you're saving money to the country by providing a cheaper form of generation. When it comes to green hydrogen, that can be true in examples where your plant is connected to a grid, because you need to be able to produce hydrogen 24/7, and sometimes with renewables that is challenging. So, but as Bloomberg says, we fully expect that during the next 8 years or so that's going to go below grid parity. But thank you very much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Fantastic. And Brendan Cronin, director at AFRY.
Thanks, Ed, and thank you to Bracewell for arranging this event, and for those who are listening, thank you also. So AFRY are a engineering and management consultancy of 17,000 people. I lead our management consultancy division for the Middle East, based in Dubai. Prior to that, I was based in the UK, and we still work very closely with our colleagues in the UK, and we try and bring the experience we've had of the energy transition in the UK and Europe. We try and bring that to the Middle East. So what do? We provide, and what do I work on? We provide strategic advice to the energy sector around the region. We've developed the rules for the wholesale electricity market in Oman, for example. We've done work with single buyers on capacity planning and demand forecasting, and we work a lot with the private sector on their strategy, identifying new markets, new technologies, what's the most promising areas for investments. And we also work a lot on M&A, providing commercial and economic advice. And as most recently, we've been doing an increasing amount of work in hydrogen in particular, and I've been leading a lot of that work, including developing a model of the future global hydrogen market to understand if the region will import, and if the region will export, and if it does export, where it might be exporting to. So delighted to be on the call today and look forward to the conversation.
And David Smith, Executive Vice President, Hydrogen and Decarbonisation, Global Marubeni, Middle East and Africa.
Very nice to be here today, and thank you, Bracewell, for inviting me. I am based in the Dubai office of Marubeni. I've been there for a year. I've been in the Middle East for 10 years now. Started with Saudi Aramco, and at Saudi Aramco, I was the chief commercial officer for all of their outsourcing on a project finance basis for large ticket projects. So anything where Aramco could be an off-taker instead of actually owning and operating the system, that was my responsibility. So think about power generation, water treatment, pipelines, refineries. It was a good experience. After that, I moved on to Taka, and this was about 2 years ago. It was the start of the entire decarbonization discussion. Got involved with some projects where we were trying to decouple water generation from power generation, as well as going after Emirates Steel to create green steel. So been in this space for a while. At Marubeni, the global mandate is held in the Dubai office. We have a couple of projects in the region. The goal is to create a balanced portfolio from a risk perspective for carbon capture projects, as well as green hydrogen and green ammonia generation projects, and to try and create a steady annual deployment of capital. So we have a 2030 mandate where we are going to decarbonize our power generation projects, as well as decarbonize companies in which we invest. So it's sort of a two-level approach, and carbon capture and storage, as well as carbon mineralization in Oman, along with 4401, is something that we are taking very seriously. The Salalah project down in the southern end of Oman is a 6 gigawatt project, 1.2 million tons of green ammonia. And again, there we are decarbonizing OQ's assets in the region by supplying them with green hydrogen. So their methanol plant will be fed with green hydrogen from our production. Their ammonia plant will also be fed by us. And then the balance will be exported to Japan and South Korea. So that's a high level of what I'm involved in. Very pleased to be here today and keen to get into the discussion.
Fantastic. And I would love it to see some questions from the audience. I see we've already got a couple coming in, so please do submit some more. But I'm gonna take advantage of my my position as moderator and jump on that first question. Really, sort of in line with that policy kind of idea that I sort of concluded my remarks with. I mean, looking at countries have made net zero pledges both in the region and beyond, and COP is coming this year. How important is that policy direction? Clint, I'm going to take this one to you. Clint, how important is policy direction when thinking about these sort of new energy plans?
Thanks, Ed. Well, I think it's very important. So it's an interesting question, because I was looking before our call today at the recent report at the end of 2021 by Irwin about the uptake of renewable energy in the region. And although there are a lot of headlines about the cheapest renewable energy tariffs in the region, Schwaber in Saudi and Al Dhafar and the DEWA projects, the record seems to have been broken every couple of months or years over the last few years. When you actually look at the uptake of renewable energy in the region, it actually lags behind many of the other regions in the world. So the report, just looking at the numbers, the Middle East renewable installed capacity is only 4.5%, which is half of the global average. The rate of growth is one of the slowest of the regions in the world. And the total installed capacity in the Middle East is 1% of the global capacity. So at the moment, the region still, thermal, nuclear, and hydro still accounts for 99% of the generation mix at the moment, including Saudi. So really, in the entire region, wind and solar is 1% of the generation capacity. So, I think setting the policy goals. So I think that's obviously coming from although there are lots of headlines about the region and there are lots of very successful projects at very low energy costs, I think, and they're big. So the big plans to expand that, as Daniel said earlier. So I think the target is 100 gigawatts of solar and wind over the next 8 to 10 years in the region. So I think to move from this base and to accelerate the growth of renewables in the region, I think policy is important. So, when we look at the most successful renewables country in the region is actually Jordan, where 33% of the capacity is renewables. And I think that was achieved obviously by a robust policy framework in Jordan, by running successful procurement rounds that were well organized and having a goal of expanding your renewables. So, and I think the countries that have been more successful in the region, Morocco, UAE, where there is a larger percentage of uptake, I think the policy background and regime has been well implemented to achieve those targets. So I think, coming back to your question, I think policy is fundamental, obviously. It sets the basis, it sets the target first, and then it sets the basis for implementation. So I suspect with COP coming to Egypt and the UAE, as you said, I think regulators will be looking at that, and we'll then I'm sure see a greater focus on expanding the renewable footprint.
And David, I'm gonna come to you. I mean, you mentioned Oman, and I think that's a really interesting example of sort of taking things sort of on that sort of front foot. What is your feeling about that sort of policy direction in terms of sort of driving this kind of conversation forward? And I suppose, obviously, also the sort of the other side of that equation being that sort of those sort of import markets, as you say, of Japan as being sort of potential off-takers of that ammonia. What are your thoughts about that sort of policy driving side?
I think right now, speaking specifically about Oman, they have a very strong interest in supporting green ammonia consumption in country as well as exports. So they're one of the countries in the region that says, this is the new oil. Now, when people say this is the new oil, there is a little bit of caution on my part, because I assume that they think this will be wildly profitable and that there will be high concession prices paid for us to generate this new oil. I think this is more of an infrastructure play, and I think the Omanis are beginning to understand that. On our particular project, we have already gotten the allocation for the land, for the wind and the sunshine. And as part of that, we are now into discussions on what should be paid to the local partner, which is OQ. I also think that from their perspective, they have invested heavily in natural gas production. So the question from their standpoint is, we are in a way creating a stranded asset. How do you balance that stranded asset with regards to this new production? And in order to solve these issues, they have created Hydrogen Development of Oman. These folks will be coming online as a regulatory body starting next year. And we've also had some very strong discussions at the EDO, Energy Development of Oman. So I think as a country, they have the regulatory policies under active discussion and formulation. So we're very pleased there.
Fantastic. And Andrej, I'm going to come to you. I mean, I think one of the things that we're sort of seeing perhaps in the US, in Europe, is there's sort of maybe there's a sort of a policy side to it, but there's also, I think, a corporate side where companies have made sort of net zero pledges. Are we sort of seeing a similar thing in the MENA region? Are companies sort of taking that pledge, or is it more of a sort of a policy and a sort of a commercially driven sort of decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the corporate animal as such is taking up the pledges, in line with what the government is saying. So we've seen definitely complications arising in relation to conventional power deals, and definitely oil and gas projects. So to use it in one example, there's a very big conventional power plant in pipeline in Saudi Arabia called Taiba. It's a 3.6 gigawatt gas-fired power station, and I think it's common knowledge that it has solicited quite a bit of debate around the decarbonisation of that asset. It's one that's obviously very important to Saudi Arabia in order to plug future gaps in its grid. But a lot of developers, a lot of corporates are asking the question, well, how does that fit within the renewable and sort of greener energy scheme in the future? So decarbonisation is extremely important, and I think to some extent quite tricky, very, very tricky. A lot of corporates, and I'm sure that, as David had mentioned, Marubeni itself had made pledges in terms of decarbonising, reducing investments in fossil fuel projects, and obviously going towards renewable energy. So that definitely is playing into the policy decisions of the governments and is bolstering the renewables market.
Fantastic, Ro. I'm gonna come to you for this question. We've got a first question from the audience. So it's from. I just lost it.
Can I make one on the net zero? Can I make one point on the net zero targets, Ed?
Absolutely.
Just a slight counterpoint, because we were very excited when we saw the net zero targets being announced. And the one thing I would say, and we've also had this discussion with clients as well, is on its own, it's actually, I would say, not that important, because particularly in Saudi, the net zero target is 2060. So what would you do differently in the next 10 years? I mean, infrastructure assets only last 30 years. So the single buyer doesn't need to make any different investment decisions than it would do, because the investment decisions it's making today will be decommissioned anyway by 2060. So I think on its own, without interim targets and other associated policies, actually I would say it's not as important as you might think, because it's so far out in the future that you don't actually need to do anything necessarily in the next 5-10 years. The one thing I would say is actually company net zero targets are, I think, at the moment having more of an influence in the region. So to be concrete, there's less interest in the Taiba CCGT in Saudi Arabia because of company level net zero targets, because people don't want to take on an asset that will still be operational in 2050. And I think that's actually having more of an impact than the national level announcements right now.
Fantastic. Daniel, did you?
Yeah, Ed, on that point, maybe there's a big risk that probably is worth highlighting, and a big responsibility for all the investors and everyone in this call is that you guys have seen that in the last months, the bonds in some of these countries in the MENA region have gone into the double digits and well into the double digits, the bonds in dollars. And these are bonds that only 12 months ago were in the mid single digits. So they're trading at double or more. Some of them are discounted at 65% of the original price, 70% of the original price. And a little bit of that is the fact that LIBOR went up a little bit. So because the bonds are in dollars, they have a little bit of pressure. But a lot of that is that money managers in New York and London simply retreated from emerging markets because of these geopolitical challenges. And that's the big risk that I want to talk about. What Clint said is true. There are 103-digit billions of dollars required in our neighborhood the next 8 years. And the PPAs are there. The ministers have created the law. I'm in London here as part of a roundtable we're doing with the Ministry of Electricity, where the Minister of Electricity is meeting with a number of investors to give them a peace of mind about investing in Egypt and the rules being clear in Egypt. And we saw, all of us who were investing in the MENA region, we saw that none of these countries defaulted on their PPA responsibilities during the COVID years, and that's not the same. That there were other emerging countries in other regions that did not do that. So I think it's important for us to remember that that yes, this interest rate may affect us a little bit, and maybe the higher cost of steel affects us a little bit, but we can calibrate and move forward. And it's our responsibility to go to our investment committees and make those deals happen. This region has a history. When there was the Arab Spring, we let things get delayed. We must not let these crossroads that we're going on at the moment delay us. The work is cut out for us. The contracts are there. We have to get out and continue that momentum that Clint was talking about.
I suppose that's something that we're seeing kind of across the world, isn't it? I mean, I think obviously as we're seeing sort of inflation rise and sort of challenges come up, I think there's going to be a big question mark about the sort of deployment of capital. I think, Ro, I'm going to come to you. I've got a question from the audience from Diego Vasquez Anzola, who says, "Where are the blue hydrogen opportunities in the Middle East or North Africa?" And I'm going to broaden that out a little bit and say, what sort of factors are going to sort of drive that? What should people be looking at to decide to try and make some sort of sense about whether investments and where investments should go in terms of that sort of MENA region in blue hydrogen?
Thanks, Ed. I mean, it's an interesting question, and especially focusing on blue hydrogen. I think when you look at blue hydrogen, what we're really talking about is the same processes that are used today for gray hydrogen, right? Steam reformate, but with a carbon capture element to it. So, I mean, naturally, I would say that the main opportunities are where these facilities already exist, where that experience already exists, and that's the UAE, that's Qatar to an extent, that is Saudi Arabia, right? Adding this element of carbon capture and maybe also converting your hydrogen to ammonia for easier transportation. I think that's a very different question to green hydrogen, where you might be looking at other resources such as cheap green electricity to enable more production of green hydrogen. And then you might be looking at places that don't have the same experience. And I know that Egypt, for example, is looking at big projects in the space, where the ultimate issue, I think, and this is the issue for hydrogen generally, and I'll just throw this into the mix, because I think one of the challenges with hydrogen is that it is very inefficient. There are a lot of costs in producing, especially green hydrogen, and especially liquefying it or converting it to ammonia and then transporting it to use in other places, which means that if you want to use it as a global fuel, for example, as a general substitution for natural gas or for oil, it's very expensive. And I think right now that is a big challenge. And we have a lot of talk around that around the world. There's a lot of pledges. There are a lot of companies looking at pilot schemes, but we're not yet necessarily, or I'm not yet seeing the emergence of a real market in the space or a clear blueprint for how this will be done in the future. Will it be done through regulation, through carbon pricing that disincentivizes other forms? Will it be done through government subsidies to grow this? And I think that is a big challenge that the hydrogen market kind of has right now, and a big question mark around what exactly the path that we're going to take is. I'd be interested in thoughts from AFRY and from others on maybe where they think this market is heading, both on the blue and green hydrogen.
Absolutely, Brendan. I'm going to come to you in a moment, but Oliver, I'm going to ask you first. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, it feels like a debate that's kind of age old, and we're only been in sort of in the hydrogen discussions for a couple of years. It feels like, but in terms of that sort of, I suppose, dispute, that kind of conflict between green and blue hydrogen. Obviously, blue hydrogen, I suppose, has historically had the edge, but we've seen the numbers. Bloomberg New Energy Finance has been saying, within the next 10 years, green is going to be cost competitive. What are your thoughts about where those green or blue hydrogen investments might be going in?
Well, I would say, actually, if we're looking at it from a project finance basis, and I think given the scale of some of the projects that you read about in the press, they would be, the developers would look to finance them off balance sheet on a limited recourse basis. Then exactly as you said in your question, the cost competitive dispute really comes into play, because who is going to bear that risk of the fact that green hydrogen is more expensive than blue hydrogen, and has some technology issues which have already been solved and banked, if you like, for blue hydrogen projects. And I'm not sure that banks are necessarily ready to take that risk at the moment. But one thing I did want to say, though, just picking up on the discussion we had before about foreign direct investment and regulatory structures, just to Daniel's point, which I thought was really interesting about the cost of debt. We talk a lot about net zero targets, and we quite often think about that in the context of governments and companies. But actually, the providers of finance, the banks, also have their own net zero targets and are looking to decarbonize their loan portfolios. I don't think we're at a place yet where commercial banks are not willing to finance CCGT. And that project that Brendan talked about, I'm not sure that's the reason why it hasn't necessarily gone forward in the way that people anticipated or hoped that it would. But I don't think we're that far off where banks will look at CCGT projects and think that they're going to pass on those projects, which is kind of an interesting question because given, and Clint touched on this before, every time there is a solar tender in the region, there's a new world record tariff. That means that the returns for the developers, as well as the banks, are inherently obviously low to support that world record tariff. And so, CCGT's got to compete with that, which means that the return is also not there for the banks, which means that if they're under pressure internally to decarbonize their portfolios, they're not going to focus on financing that sector. And I do think we are going to start to see the impact of that, because it will mean that there will be even more liquidity for these renewable assets, which in turn, should drive, going back to your original point, the availability of liquidity in the market for things like green hydrogen projects, because you'll have these huge pools of capital that just need to be deployed in that type of project, because there aren't other projects that are suitable for banks, credit committees to fund.
Fantastic. And Brendan, I'm going to come to you on that sort of hydrogen note. We will certainly come back to the solar question, but just on that sort of hydrogen note. I mean, I know that you guys have recently done some research on that sort of hydrogen question. Maybe you could just shed a little bit of light about your sort of your house view on that sort of the MENA region sort of hydrogen capacity and sort of how it fits into that kind of global picture.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ed. So I think on blue hydrogen, to be pretty concrete, I think you need to look at who are the low cost gas producers today. So there, I think you need to look particularly at Qatar and Abu Dhabi, and maybe to a lesser extent Oman and Egypt. I would say though the blue hydrogen I think is probably going to be less accessible to most private developers, because those projects are probably going to be led by the NOCs themselves, or certainly have a strong involvement. So it's going to be ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, it's going to be Qatar Energy in Qatar. So I think it's going to be more private opportunities in green hydrogen. I think in terms of a house view, we are working on it, and it is very uncertain. I think the one thing I would say is that export projects, the business case as it stands today is to be honest not there, because there isn't sufficient. You need to have somewhere in the chain a carbon price signal, probably of more than $100 a ton of CO2, to get the economics to justify making the investment or spending additional money to produce low carbon hydrogen compared to conventional hydrogen. And nowhere in the world, even in Europe, is the carbon price at $100 a ton. So the business case is I think very difficult still. But if we are going to move to net zero and we're going to displace gas as a source of heat, then we're going to have to look at things like hydrogen. So you're going to have those kind of price signals. But we would say the business case is pretty challenging right now, and that's why I think you're seeing a lot of interest, because people can see the need for it in the long term. So there's a lot of MOUs, but actually there's not been a project in the Middle East, or I think anywhere, possibly except for there's a hybrid steel project in Sweden. I don't think any at-scale low-carbon hydrogen project has gotten to financial close, and that I think speaks to the missing link, which is a strong carbon price signal to support the ambition.
And Daniel, I'm going to come to you. I mean, I think, look, obviously there is a sort of a hydrogen question, and that's that kind of pool of capital that Oliver talked about. But I mean, when you're looking at the sort of, balance of sort of how these projects stack up, how hydrogen may, compare with solar, what are your thoughts about that sort of investability question?
So I'm going to say something, see if Clint agrees with me, but I'm going to argue that there's a link between wheat and hydrogen. And bear with me. So wheat futures hit $1,300 this week, right? This is in a world where before these geopolitical challenges, it was in the $250 world, right? And in our neighborhood here, we have some of the biggest food importers in the world. So what that is doing is that we're seeing some of the ministers in the region growing an urgency to really export more of that gas or import less of that gas, especially now with gas being more expensive, and becoming a lot more conscious of really tightening the local budgets. And that is much easier to do when you're building wind farms or solar plants, or maybe even water desalination, things that you can do saving money. Yeah. When it comes to hydrogen, as a few people said here, there's a subsidy involved. And let's remember what happened back in the day in 2008, 2007, when subsidies were required for solar PV and wind. They were built in Germany and in Spain and in Italy. Why? Because the cost of capital over there is much cheaper. So if you have to subsidize something, it's much cheaper to subsidize it over there. You're right, the cost of debt has increased in Germany. A year ago was minus 0.3%, the 5-year bond. Today is between 0.6 and 0.7%. But the cost of debt in Egypt in the same period went from 4 to 5% to 11 to 12%. That's why usually stuff gets subsidized in OECD economies, and we bring them here once they are below grid parity. That's why it seems to be a little bit counterintuitive to be subsidizing hydrogen, but nevertheless, we will see what happens.
Clint, what are your thoughts to Daniel's statement?
So, as a client, I obviously cannot disagree with what Daniel says, for sure. But I think, yes, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think we're kind of at an interesting crossroads at the moment with the recent events after COVID, with the Ukraine war, increasing commodity prices, inflation, increasing oil. So I think there's this interesting dichotomy between, as we touched on earlier, the oil exporting nations and the oil importing nations. And I think the investment cases for each of those countries are different. And it's going to be interesting to see what the increase in the oil price and the increase in the solar commodity prices, how those are going to come full circle, going to impact decarbonization, going to impact the COP targets and so on. Are the oil exporting countries going to continue expanding renewables to save oil and gas to export, and are the poorer, the importing countries on the other side of the coin, are they going to ramp up renewables to save the import costs? That's hopefully that's hopefully going to be the case. But on the other hand, will the increase in solar commodity prices and the increase in the oil price, will that slow down the move to renewables in some of the oil exporting countries? I think it's too early to tell. I think that's the danger. So I think when we look at this region, it's you always need to look at the two sides of the coin. You need to look at the oil exporting countries and the oil importing countries, because the investment cases are quite different. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how these recent changes are going to manifest themselves. I think we as a firm, and Andrej can speak to this as well because he's seeing this on a number of his projects, but we are definitely seeing quite a big impact on the recent increase in solar panel prices and commodity prices. So solar panel prices make up 50% or so of the construction costs of a solar project, and there's been a very significant increase in those costs, obviously, over the last year or so. So, I think we've broken the cycle of ever decreasing energy solar prices. So if you look at the REPTA round 3, the tariffs are higher than previous solar projects. I think that's a factor that's being affected by commodity prices. So I think the danger is that the cycle we're in now is going to it is already delaying a number of renewables projects, and even is challenging the bankability of those projects, because the costs no longer stack up. So I think those are the interesting questions at the moment, and we'll have to see where it goes over the next few years. But certainly we are seeing a delay in some renewable projects because of the impact of commodity prices.
Fantastic. And I suppose with those sort of higher solar prices, obviously that will inevitably sort of feed through into higher green hydrogen prices, based on the idea that that's going to potentially be driving the electrolyzers. Andrej, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so just because, as lawyers, we can't help ourselves. So I think there's also quite an interesting structuring point to be made. And it's quite attractive, and we see that throughout the media, the discussions, and so on, to throw everything into the mix under the same banner. So we've got renewable energy, right? So we've got solar panels, wind farms, various different other sort of renewable energy power stations as such. We can name quite a few, and then green hydrogen, or hydrogen is various different guises, the sort of color code that we've been talking about. But fundamentally, they're two different things. So from a structuring perspective, we all know this, on the call, that to do a power plant is very different to do an oil and gas deal or a petchem deal. And the truth is that hydrogen is more akin to a petchem / oil and gas deal as opposed to a power plant, right? And there's a very important difference between the two, because when you do a power deal, those are usually structured on the basis that there is, and I'm taking the merchant market countries out of the picture, so United States and a few others. But by and large, in the Middle East, we've got a single regulated tariff and single regulated off-taker structure. The tariff under the power deal is predetermined, right? It's written into the power purchase agreement. It's there for 15 in Oman, 20, 25 years, 30 years, Qatar, so on. Hydrogen, on the other hand, is looking at more of a merchant market approach, which is more what we would refer in sort of petchem transactions, right? And those are bankable, and to Ollie's point, in terms of financing and the like, on the basis that you can take a view in terms of where that outcome is going to be. What is the price point of that commodity? So that's what it is. It's the commodity market, right? It's the energy commodity market. It's the energy molecule of tomorrow. Hopefully, we all hope, right? But structurally, there's a fundamental difference between the two, and to kind of line them up side by side is actually a bit skewed, because they don't work the same. The other thing I think to remember, and sort of to I think point out, Daniel spoke about this, Clint spoke about this. We had feed-in tariffs. A lot of people have forgotten about that. A lot of subsidies. Enough has been said in terms of where they originated and how they sort of spread to the emerging markets. But those assets also could plug into existing assets, right? So you took the renewable energy plant and you plugged them into the grid. There you go. Lights were on. Perfect. Obviously, we had to equalize the grid and so on, but the actual volume of the renewable energy still is such that it doesn't really disrupt the cycle power that we live off. Hydrogen is different. It doesn't just easily plug into existing infrastructure. I mean, we know this, right? It's smaller molecules. You can't transport it through pipes. It's corrosive. You can't just plug it into ordinary gas pipelines and the like. Difficult. It's not an easy play. And then, Ed, to your question and to your point, and I've just sort of avoided that a little bit. We've got a very, very interesting international market, one which is completely different to where we were 2 years ago. Everyone was talking about massive deflationary pressures, right? Most governments were, in fact, trying to push their markets forward such that there would be inflation, right? We had the sort of Japanese-style deflation occurring in Europe and the US. And now we're at 8.4%, I think, by the last count in the United States of America, right? It's crazy. It absolutely is crazy. We've gone through a wild swing, and that definitely is making everyone rethink anything that they've sort of planned in relation to any of these deals, because it is making it more difficult.
Absolutely. And I think, maybe sort of, focusing a little bit more on that sort of solar side of things. I mean, in terms of Oliver, I'm going to bring this one to you. Looking at the plans to sort of roll out solar plans and trying to work out who's kind of doing it best. Do you have any feelings about those kind of about those constraints? I mean, we've heard sort of inflation. We've heard, I suppose the sort of, the challenge of logistics. Do you have any sense of who's doing the best sort of despite these challenges?
Thanks, Ed. I mean, I think, as Clint alluded to, there are some significant supply chain issues at the moment in the solar market, particularly in some of the new projects that have been tendered in the last 18 months or so in the Middle East. So I wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable saying which country is doing it best. But what I would say is that, going back probably to the first question you asked about regulatory, the importance of regulatory regime, I mean, undoubtedly, the Middle East countries have successfully adopted what was already a very successful program for IPPs and IWPs for thermal power generation for renewable utility scale renewable projects. And you've seen that, in the region where we have, CSP, we have, just ginormous solar deals, but we've also managed solar projects, but we've also managed to do it in the oil importing countries such as, for example, Jordan. Just to pick up on something that Andrej was saying about structuring point, and again, as lawyers, we just can't help ourselves, but I do think he made a good point about trying to compare, apples with oranges. So, for example, there was a country in a procuring authority in the Middle East region that came out with a tender for a battery storage project. But because it was battery storage, and I guess it, fell into the bucket of green, they used the renewable energy, the solar PPA as the basis for their storage lease agreement, whereas actually they would have been better off, I think, using the thermal generation, power purchase agreement as a starting point, because obviously thermal generation, you can dispatch it well. And I think there is a bit of a danger when people look at it and talk about it in that way, that they kind of conflate the idea of green technologies and think that they all operate in the same way, when in fact they are very different. And of course, it's the same for wind and solar and CSP and green hydrogen and battery storage. These are just very different technologies that require bespoke solutions. And so, in answer to your question, I think, for example, the GCC countries that are well publicized, such as the UAE and Saudi, where they have implemented these huge utility scale projects, and of course in Qatar, where we recently worked on an 800 megawatt one as well. They've done a good job, certainly on the solar projects, because they have addressed what the developers need to meet their internal returns, and they've obviously produced something that is bankable. And we were very pleased to work on two projects in the last 18 months that JBIC, the Japanese Export Credit Agency, also supported from a debt financing perspective. They were their first renewable projects in the region. And again, I think that shows the strength of confidence that investors, both debt and equity, have in the Middle East IPP model.
I mean, talking about the sort of the IPP, Daniel, I was going to come to you. Tell us your thoughts.
Sorry, no, I just thought, to complement what Oli just said, the leadership of these countries has been evolving. So I think it's fair to highlight the government of the United Arab Emirates and Masdar, because they built the first PV plant in the Middle East and the first CSP plant in the Middle East back before renewable energy was so fashionable as it is today, right? It was actually the first non-recourse project finance for CSP in the world, what Masdar did back in the day with Shams. And then after that, Jordan came and became what Bloomberg called, as Bloomberg said, as Clint said, the third most successful investment destination of any emerging market in the world by Bloomberg in 2018. And then about the same time, Morocco came and became world champion in terms of low cost of wind and low cost of CSP. And so worldwide, This was the cheapest, at the time, the cheapest plants in the world. And now Egypt came out with the largest solar facility in the world, and by several people is recognized as a world-class example. So it is true, we're a small neighborhood compared to how many gigawatt hours you deploy in North America. But the countries independently have played a lead role, and there is a bedrock, the culture of the IWPP, right, which Clint was working on back in the day in the combined cycles. That culture of IWPP, where there is a PPA and project finance and all the rest, is very strong and has allowed for these countries to bring foreign direct investment that way.
Sure. Clint, please.
Ed, I just wanted to ask Daniel a question actually on solar, and I think we haven't touched on yet. And the question is, to what extent the region's grids are holding back renewable deployment. So, for example, in Jordan, I think the installed capacity is about 33% of the capacity. And I think a lot of the projects that had been slated have been held back because of grid instability issues. And I know also that there are a number of initiatives in Egypt as well to strengthen the grid, and there's some interconnections that are being discussed as well. So is this an issue, obviously in Jordan, but wider? Would deployment be increased if the grid was more stable and strengthened?
There's a silent bias. You guys know Christopher Columbus. He discovered Latin America. He's very famous for that. But you don't know all the other people that left in a boat from Europe and didn't get anywhere, right? Because they didn't come back. So that's the way I answer the question. There's a silent bias because a lot of projects are developed by developers who don't have strong law firms and technical advisors, and they don't realize that they are putting development money into projects that don't have offtake connectivity, and they don't happen. And what Clint is saying is true. I would say tens of millions are lost every year by people who don't think it through. You saw many projects in Jordan had to wait for this famous green corridor that was eventually built. And you guys played a lead role in Benban in Egypt, and there was a lot of pressure to make sure that the redundancy line was built. Because the reality is that sophisticated investors will not receive your blessing to go ahead with non-recourse project finance absent of a proper interconnection. So what is very sad is that that's very easy for us to know, people like you guys or us, because we have played the game before. But it's very sad that many families that put some hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars of their savings in their local countries, where they're in Tunisia or Lebanon, they don't know these things. And unfortunately, there are a lot of accidents because of that. It's true.
Oliver.
Ed, I don't want to usurp you as the chief question asker, but I've got a question for Brendan following on from that question. So just picking up on Clint's point about grid instability and the influx of renewable generation assets in the region. One thing that I think is quite interesting, if you think about it or look at it from a battery storage perspective, is actually whether or not these energy storage assets, whether it's actually appropriate for them to be tendered on the sort of traditional IPP basis, or whether actually we would be better off in terms of grid stability and balancing, having them procured directly by the host governments and just having them form part of the state's transmission system.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very good and open question. So I think the issue is there's many, batteries can be used and have been used in different parts of the world in many different ways. So in Europe, they're used for frequency response, so providing power for just a couple of seconds, but spending most of their time on standby. In other parts of the world, they're used for off-grid to provide something like baseload power. And then again, in other parts of the world, they're used as part of grid connected, but just making revenue from a merchant market. And the way they're used is very different, and those use cases will likely evolve over time. I would say today, the most promising use case is to use batteries for frequency response. So instead of running a conventional IPP below full load, you just have a battery there that's able to provide frequency response at short notice. That's definitely, in my view, in the GCC, the most promising use case today. But that might evolve in 5-10 years. And when you have an IPP model, the contract structure is quite rigid, and you might want a different tariff structure today than the tariff structure you might want in 5 or 10 years' time. So there is an argument, isn't it just better for the grid company himself to build it, because it's also relatively simple containerized technology. But on the flip side, the private sector has been very good at, procuring power, delivering power projects, delivering cost reductions. So, I honestly don't know the right answer. The other aspect of it is it's very, in many markets, or certainly in Abu Dhabi and Oman, I think the sector law would probably prevent the transmission company from owning the asset. So there's also that, but that's more a regulatory kind of a legal question. But it is a question, because batteries are fundamentally different to a power generation technology. They're not a power generation technology. They're moving power from one time period to the next. So I think it's a very relevant point.
Ro, I'm going to bring this to you. Maybe you could just bring us up to speed for those in the audience who may not be entirely au fait with the sort of the way in which batteries work, particularly in the region, and maybe you could shed a bit of light on that.
Of course, thanks, Ed. I mean, first of all, there isn't that much battery storage in the region. I think, a country we haven't spoken about, Israel, which isn't traditionally considered sort of MENA in this investment context, is probably the leader, at least in terms of battery storage pipeline. But I think what Brendan and Ollie and everyone have been talking about kind of raises a very important point, I think, and that is, as you transition your grid over to renewable energy, and in this case solar, the cost goes up the more megawatts you put in, right? The first few percentage can just be absorbed by the grid as is, because you already have a stable grid. As you go higher and higher in your proportion, up to 50 and eventually 100%, the cost of each extra megawatt goes up, because you need more supporting infrastructure to enable that to take place. So when you look at the energy importing countries, I think you can probably look at that and say, well, as that pricing of the infrastructure comes down, as battery storage pricing comes down, that makes a lot of sense for them. But for the oil exporting nations, there's sort of a very interesting question there, because it'll definitely be cheaper for them to continue using fossil fuels, maybe in combination with CCS, rather than, as they increase their solar and other renewable energy, to start putting more battery storage and other advanced technology on their grid to make that operate. When we look at the UK, for example, we have a very developed market here for battery storage, and National Grid is an exceptionally adept regulator for driving that market, for the frequency response that Brendan spoke about. But I don't feel like we're anywhere near that stage in most Middle Eastern countries, although countries such as Jordan perhaps should start looking at this very seriously if they want to continue growing that renewable energy base.
Just a quick response from me.
Sure.
I think the one market that might do something, and I think has said there might do something, I think I agree with what Rose said, is that broadly the markets aren't as developed and the opportunities aren't going to be as much. I think Abu Dhabi has recognized the value of frequency response, batteries, the value of batteries in providing frequency response. And they've mentioned this in their last capacity statement, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Abu Dhabi going forward a battery project. That might be the one kind of exception in the GCC that you might see some utility scale battery, but then I think it'll be one project. It's not going to be a big boom of gigawatts of projects across multiple sites.
And just sticking with you, Brendan, I mean, just kind of, I suppose, sort of following on from Rose's point about that kind of competitiveness of natural resources, right? And I mean, that obviously, I suppose that sort of prevents or delays sort of a move into a battery. Do you think that batteries will have more of a place in future, or is it a sort of an interesting trial, but maybe batteries on for the Middle East?
So I think there's a case for frequency response, which is quite a unique. Every market needs a couple of % of its capacity to be available at short notice for frequency response. So that creates the case for maybe a few hundred megawatts of batteries. Beyond that, I think the low level of renewables Daniel mentioned. You need a lot of renewables on the grid to really make the case for energy arbitrage. You really need there to be too much renewables at certain times. You need renewables to be curtailed, at which point the power is free. You need that to create the business case to take free power at middle of the day and use that overnight when there's no solar. And until you have quite a lot of renewables, that business case is pretty weak. And maybe just Ollie the only other point that I would say before Ollie maybe mention this is maybe behind transmission constraints as well. Instead of building a big power line to transport a lot of renewables from the inland to the coastal areas, maybe a battery can smooth that out. That might be the other use case, but pure energy arbitrage, I think it's difficult. I'd be interested to hear Ollie's viewpoint on this, definitely.
Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. So actually, it's less of a viewpoint, but more of a question, Brendan, because obviously we're focused on the Middle East region here. So what do you think the impact is then of the Baraka nuclear power plant in the UAE? Because I think when we talk about battery storage coupled with renewables, very often we talk about that maybe in other parts of the world in the context of solving the perennial baseload issue of having renewable power generation. Whereas obviously in this part of the world, in particular in Abu Dhabi and in UAE, you have got this ginormous nuclear power plant that provides baseload for the next 60 years.
So I think my immediate reaction to that is I think the big change that Baraka has for the power system, the GCC, and it is worth saying that the GCC is largely, from the point of view of the power system, it's synchronous, so the frequency is the same for the whole of the GCC except for Saudi, which is 60 hertz, but the rest of the region is asynchronous, so that from an electron's point of view, it doesn't see the border. Pre-Baraka, the biggest single power generator unit on the system was, I think, around about 600 megawatts. So if the biggest power unit tripped, 600 megawatts went offline, and the frequency fell, and you needed some frequency response to support it. With Baraka, it goes from 600 megawatts now to 1400. So the big impact is we need more frequency response because there's a larger individual potential loss of load. And that may well be why Abu Dhabi is looking at batteries for frequency response. The other impact of Baraka is potentially solar curtailment happens earlier, particularly in Abu Dhabi, compared to other parts of the region, which may in future also create some additional business case for battery storage. But yeah, Baraka makes it's low carbon, it's huge amounts of low carbon power, which is great, but it does create some system operation issues, which can be and will be solved in part by batteries.
Daniel, I'm going to take this battery question to you. I mean, I think obviously we're sort of hearing about some of the challenges it's facing. I mean, from your point of view as an investor, how willing are you to jump into the battery pool?
So just first disclosure, we have not put as much research into batteries because they have not really been necessary in the region, as Ollie mentioned. That aside, that said, we did see an auction in Jordan that didn't work. We bid on it, but the auction didn't work because the government wasn't able to guarantee the number of cycles that they would use the battery, and without that, you cannot guarantee the cost of operating a battery. So we're finding that because the region doesn't really need it, and because the costs were not there at the time, this was a good clean. This was 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, maybe. Now, that said, if we put that little parenthesis aside, the cost of batteries has gone down 90% in the last 10 years. And between now and 2030, the world is going to put $260 billion into batteries. Yeah. Just the top 5 battery suppliers are worth over $12 billion. So clearly the markets think we're going to get batteries that are able to provide what we need below our levelized cost of electricity. Clearly the market thinks that. I just think that because we're in these early stages, we're still not using them. The only other thing I would say, Ed, is you will be surprised how important is the role that people in this room play as you guys talk to members of government or some of these lead investors in the region, that you point them to highlight that perhaps following what the UK did, that they built batteries on a centralized basis. They didn't force the developers to do it, but the government did it on a centralized basis, which is much more efficient, and that allowed for some battery deployment. There's a role to play. In the case of Jordan, I think they're overdue. I mean that respectfully. We hear that now there's going to be an additional utility renewable plant, and then after that they will do some batteries. But like I said, it's not a matter that we're experts. We don't know it very well.
And Clint, I see that we've got a question from the audience from Alexander Sims. He says, with electrolyzer capacity seeming to be the weak link in the chain for green hydrogen, what is the strategy for improving this? And I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna broaden it a little bit. I mean, I think we're seeing some, obviously there's this question is about electrolyzers, but I think we're seeing challenges as we mentioned in the solar PV industry with those increased module prices. We're seeing this obviously there's increasing pressure on the rare earths that are going to go into batteries. So it feels like the demand is rising. We've seen some problems in China, particularly with the sort of extended COVID lockdowns and some of the sort of disruptions to global flows. So looking at these challenges for electrolyzers, for solar PV, for batteries, seemingly for the whole sort of package, what can companies do to try and sort of navigate this sticky situation?
Well, that's a good question. And a difficult one to answer. So I think it's something that we haven't touched on this call. So we've obviously discussed the increase in commodity prices, and there's been a massive change in the world economy to a globalized economy over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And I think what a lot of people are talking about now is a deglobalization of economies and a deglobalization of supply chains. And I think we've touched on that on the call today. So it's going to be interesting to see, and I guess for this region, that's an opportunity because from what a lot of what I'm reading on hydrogen is that a lot of governments see hydrogen over the next 20, 30, 40 years as an industry that can replace oil as the major export industry for the region. So I guess this crunch on commodity prices and supply chains breaking down during COVID, and what we're seeing in the Ukraine war and inflation. It's going to be interesting to see whether governments in the region say, well, why don't we look at deglobalizing and localizing some of those supply chains? And there have been a lot of discussions over the years of, on the back of a solar industry to localize parts of the supply chain. And I think that's kind of happening, but it hasn't really happened. So I suspect from a policy, going right back to the very first question, from a policy decision, I would have, there may be some opportunities that are created by some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the increases in commodity prices for, well-funded oil exporting governments to try and create a greater impetus on localizing some of these industries and creating a sort of a services sector and a manufacturing sector around some of these supply chains, whether it's solar, whether it's hydrogen, and so on. So I think, those are my thoughts on the topic. I don't know if anyone else. I wonder if David has any thoughts on that question, which seems quite aimed at hydrogen.
David, what thoughts about how to tackle that sort of logistics crunch?
So again, this is something that we've seen before when gas turbines were in short supply. You had to go and create frame agreements and make early arrangements with gas turbine manufacturers. I think the same thing is happening now with electrolyzers. We are also seeing large factories being put up in India. So Ohmium International is a very big electrolyzer, making electrolyzers, 1 gigawatt factory already in operation in India. So I think the Europeans are coming out with sophisticated PEM electrolyzers that will also partly address this grid storage need. So PEM electrolyzers can always support the grid. Going back to this idea that it would just be batteries, I think there will be some support from electrolyzers. And I also think that even countries such as the UAE are now talking about having their own battery supply companies, right? So they are in the process of talking to chemical suppliers and saying, from the standpoint of a military that needs batteries, a grid that needs batteries, we need to have our own manufacturing base in the GCC, right? So I've seen the Saudis talk about this, and I've seen the UAE talk about this, and I think this will happen.
Andrej, I'm going to come to you on this as well. I mean, I think we've talked about this in the past, about this kind of potential for sort of reshoring, nearshoring, whatever. Are there any sort of challenges that this would bring up? I mean, we've talked about I suppose the way in which sort of solar PV prices have come down incredibly, in the last sort of 10 years or so, and it seems to be largely sort of driven by that sort of the economies of scale that you can get in Chinese manufacturing. If you bring those factories into, I don't know, say the UAE or Egypt, say, can you hold on to those price cuts that have really allowed the sector to take off in quite the way that it has?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably one that people cleverer than I can answer. Probably Daniel or someone along those lines. But I would have thought that at least initially the prices would have to go up. I mean, there's a reason why offshoring happened in the first place. Corporates obviously sought out the best markets for the manufacturing of whatever it is that they need to do, right? So it made sense to take a lot of the manufacturing to countries which had lower cost of labor, lower cost of real estate, accessibility in terms of routes and exportation, transportation, logistics, and the like, right? Now, I suspect, without being a world economist, that China, Vietnam, Indonesia, a lot of sort of Asian countries as such benefited greatly from that offshoring exercise, which saw, I think, a lot of what we would refer to as the Western world, the US, the Europe, so on, taking a lot of their traditional manufacturing facilities offshore. Now, to the point of localization, and then, I guess, sort of bringing back a lot of that manufacturing, what we have noticed, obviously, is that to the previous trend in the 90s, which was primarily offshoring, there is a different market to be had, right? We know that a lot of the manufacture process is now mechanized, which is quite different to what it was back in the days. So cost of labor obviously is not such a huge element in consideration. There's also something to be said about being closer to the input. And certainly when it comes to photovoltaic panels, Clint mentioned this earlier, about 50% of the cost of a solar plant is basically the panels. The balance of plant is maybe roughly the remaining 50% or maybe even less. And a large component of those panels is obviously an oil byproduct, right? So being close to manufacturing facilities to the input, such as in the Middle East, could make sense. The question, though, is whether the entire value chain is going to be available, right? So it's not something that you just simply make overnight. So there's obviously a lot of oil here, so that obviously goes and lends itself well towards potentially manufacturing of solar panels here in the Middle East, but equally so do you have the processing plants to create the various different byproducts that go into those solar panels? And the answer to that is no. We know that. we know that a lot. There are definitely a lot of petchem plants out here, but not ones that sort of easily lend themselves towards the input or the input materials for solar panels. So in the short to medium term, I would say that the price would potentially go up. It has to. The infrastructure isn't there. Whether in the long term it makes a lot of sense, I think that's another question. But it's one where, bizarrely again, similarly to where I guess this entire renewable energy revolution started, which was with, as we mentioned before, feed-in tariffs, contract for difference in the UK, and so on, where there were subsidies in relation to renewable energy. Then perhaps too, there might be some policy-driven investments by governments to make sure that some of this manufacturing can happen onshore, and that it is in the future price competitive.
Daniel, Andrej very much threw you under the logistics cost bus. So, what are your thoughts?
We had a little bit of experience with that in the region. There is a concept of GDP destruction, and I don't want to go, but I have to go back to the cost of capital point. Is that people have tried to move some of that manufacturing from China to other countries with a lower credit rating or higher cost of capital, or from Germany to other emerging market countries, to not call a name. And if you do a financial model, you will be immediately destroying GDP in the country where you put the manufacturing, because the moment that it's cheaper to do something somewhere else and bring it, you shouldn't do it locally. That is called GDP destruction. It's the economic term for that. And a little known fact that we learned, fortunately, early on in one of the projects we worked in Turkey, that sometimes governments actually create this localization, I think it's called, right? Where a little bit of the tariff is something that you only get if you manufacture locally. Sometimes that sounds smart, but several of the largest multilaterals in the world, and we are, we're not a big company like Marubeni. We need to work with multilaterals. Some of the largest multilaterals in the world do not provide financing for revenues that are the result of localization. So whether it's GDP destruction or the fact that you cannot finance the project, is a very difficult subject. As David said, it's tricky and it's something that you have to look at carefully.
Absolutely, and I think I've got a slight eye on the time, but I've still got a question left about kind of carbon taxes, and I think we're seeing this kind of growing in the EU and beyond. And I think Canada has also discussed the possibility of imposing carbon taxes. And sort of thinking about the impact on industries and who should be kind of keeping an eye. And I suppose it does sort of tie into that sort of manufacturing idea. David, let's start with you. What are your thoughts about say the carbon border and the sort of potential for additional taxes to try and sort of level that playing field? Oh, David, I'm not sure we can hear you. We might come back. Oh, no, you're back. Please fire in.
I'm back. Okay. So again, speaking specifically about the Oman project, a key goal there was to try and drop as much green hydrogen product in Oman. And in order for us to achieve this, we have been in discussions with folks that would face cross-border adjusted mechanism taxes going into Europe. And we specifically started talking to steel manufacturers. So rather than have them sort of import our green ammonia into Korea, we're talking about them potentially setting up their steel mill in Oman, right? So what is that carbon tax? We know that Oman is stepping up to imposing carbon taxes. We've heard different numbers. We think it might go all the way up to $125 to $145 a ton. And that creates a significant price lift in our ammonia pricing. So currently, between an off-taker price and I would say $70 of carbon taxes, we believe we can make these projects work. Again, we don't have much visibility as to what is the long-term carbon tax, and that's one of the challenges. But I think the cross-border mechanism is getting more mature, and I think that's driving people in the aluminum industry, for example, in Bahrain, in the Emirates Global Aluminum. These people, Emirates Steel, looking at this very seriously, and they're all looking at how do they make green production, and there are lots of ways of doing that, and this is a very active dialogue.
Oliver, I'm going to take this to you just briefly. I mean, what are your thoughts about the potential for? I mean, I suppose we've talked about that sort of idea about sort of exports of hydrogen, I suppose. But I suppose in terms of sort of maybe sort of shifting it sort of further downstream, and as David has said, sort of maybe exporting steel. What sort of an opportunity do you see for the some Middle East region in that regard?
Well, I think actually Clint touched on this before in terms of the disparity between the oil exporting countries and the oil importing countries. So, I think you would have to look at the region in two different ways for that. Unquestionably, the oil exporting companies definitely have an advantage, don't they, in the ability to have lower production costs, which will drive, the cost of their manufacturing base. I'm not sure this is going to exactly answer your question, but I just wanted to pick up, and I know we're running out of time, on something that Daniel said in one of our pre-calls that I just thought was a really interesting point that I hadn't heard before, which was the impact on the economy of, this, if you like, cheap electricity, which eventually emerging markets will benefit from renewable sources, because they won't have to pay, the fuel costs, and they'll have, the free electricity that comes from the sun and the wind. And at what point that will start to feed through to emerging markets, and whether or not that might actually reduce the advantage that the oil exporting over the oil importing countries, for example, things like, manufacturing of steel and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. And Brendan, I mean, David's talked about that kind of carbon tax. What are your thoughts on how that might change things? I mean, obviously, you mentioned the sort of the carbon pricing as a potential driver of hydrogen.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant when I talked about carbon pricing for hydrogen is in the destination market, so in the European and Japanese markets. On the potential for carbon pricing or a carbon tax in the Middle East, I actually think there's maybe less potential than there is elsewhere in the world. So, if you broadly, the emissions in the Middle East come from three things. They come from power and water generation, transport, and industry. And I think the likelihood of a carbon price in the power and water sector is pretty unlikely, because decisions are made centrally anyway on new capacity. So the easier way of implementing a decarbonization target is to just instruct a single buyer to target zero carbon, and therefore just procure renewables and CCS and don't procure any gas. So there's not a need for a carbon price in the power sector. The transportation sector, typically elsewhere in the world, doesn't have a carbon price. So really, you're just left with industry that could potentially have a carbon price in the GCC, and may well do, although also a lot of industry is government owned, so you might see a different approach. So I think it'll evolve. You got to recognize the idiosyncrasies of the Middle East and think about how things might be implemented around here. But David's point is interesting. I hadn't heard of talk of carbon pricing in Oman, so maybe Oman will look at things differently, or maybe that's specifically around industry. But I think, David, to some extent, you're also talking about the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is like the EU imposing, if you don't have a carbon price in your producing market, the EU will tax you at the point of import to reflect the carbon price in the EU. So effectively, steel makers and aluminium manufacturers in the Middle East who are selling to Europe will face a carbon price at the European level. And I think also, is it metals and electricity as well? But it's only certain heavy industries, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
And Daniel, a quick word from you.
Very quick on that point, we actually had an adverse surprise in one of our projects, because in Egypt, if you assume that $80-100 that you can make in Europe, obviously the economics become much better. But we realized that none of these projects that we do, whether it's Egypt, Jordan, even Uzbekistan, qualifies for the European market. It has to be sold in the local market, which is below 10% of the European price. And if you allow me, Ed, I just want to say one thing, that, all this, we've gone through basically all the challenges of developing these projects. In the case of Alcazar, all the 7 projects we have developed, built, operated, were really led from a legal perspective by Bracewell. And Ed, I can tell you stories. We had fires in the projects. We had a lightning strike, turbine fell down. We had communities come and ask for more things, local developers. We even had an act of God at some point. We had COVID, and the projects did a little bit better than the budget, and they all, and we all did very well for that. So, and that didn't happen to all the developers in the region. So I just want to say on behalf of all of our partners at Alcazar that we really appreciate the relationship, guys. Tracy as well, Oli, Clint, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. And just Clint, I'm going to come to you for a closing word, as I'm very conscious of the time. Just on that kind of idea about sort of carbon prices and I suppose future regulations, to what extent do you think that people need to kind of see what might be coming and how that, I mean, obviously we're talking about a kind of the carbon adjustment mechanism, and how do people kind of get ahead of that, and does that feed into kind of commercial decisions taken now?
So I know that this is already factoring heavily into people's thinking in the region, and in surprising ways. So I know that there are a lot of PPAs, for example, that are coming to the end of their lives in Abu Dhabi and in Oman. And I know that a number of the developers are looking at carbon pricing and what they can do with those projects and carbon capture projects to benefit from carbon pricing. So I think a lot of people think that carbon pricing obviously is going to increase significantly, and a lot of people are looking at how projects in the region can benefit from that market. So you're coming back to the first question on policy. I think this is something that could benefit from a policy directive in the region. But I think decarbonization, carbon pricing, carbon credits are certainly on the agenda for developers in the region, producers in the region, and as we discussed a little bit earlier, a lot of industries are looking at how they can couple themselves with green energy to benefit from carbon prices. So I think carbon will increasingly over the next 10 years play a very significant role in thinking around projects.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you so much all for these amazing insights that you've shared. But unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to say thank you to the panel for sharing their time and expertise, and of course Bracewell for making this event possible. I'd like to thank you to the audience for participating. We really value the input and the insights generated. I think it's been really interesting that I think of the questions we're really looking at hydrogen. So I think there's an interesting indicator of how you all feel about that. I think that there's been a lot to think about over this last hour and a half. So you can watch this again, or you can share it with a friend or a colleague if you think they might benefit. There will be a video on demand. With that, and a final thank you from me, I'll say goodbye. I've been Ed Reed. Thank you.